When you're setting up a game, players need to go through the following steps, referred as a pre-game sequence. Decide on the size of the game. Share your army list with your opponent. Build a battlefield. Determine the deployment type. Determine the secondary objective. Determine the deployment zones. Select spells. Declare special deployment. And proceed to the deployment phase. The game types may be typically between 1,500 points to 8,000 points for serious battles. The 9-age fantasy battles is intended to be played on a board that is 72 inches wide and 48 inches deep. For smaller battles involving warbands, we recommend playing on a board that is 36 inches wide and 48 inches deep. So, you should divide the board into 24 cross 24 inch sections. If the board is 36 inches cross 48 inches, you are dividing it into 18 cross 24 inches sections. You place the following terrain features in the center of 3 different randomly selected sections: impassable terrain, hill, and 1 forest. Move each terrain feature 2d6 inches in a random direction. Add 2d3 additional terrain features in the center of a different randomly selected sections. For an example, you may move each additional terrain feature to 2d6 in a random direction. On a table, you may have hill, water terrain, field, forest, ruins, impassable terrain, and wall. Here you can see the actual deployment types. It's frontline clash, dawn assault, counter thrust, encircle, and refused flank. Also, we are having our secondary objectives. Hold the ground. At the end of each game turn, after the first, the player with the most scoring units within 6 inches of a center of the board gains a counter. At the end of the game, the player with the most such counters wins the secondary objective. Breakthrough. The player with the most scoring units inside their opponent's deployment zone at the end of the game, up to a maximum of 3, wins a secondary objective. Spoils of War. You place 3 markers in the line, dividing the board into halves. 1 marker is placed with its center of a point on this line that is as close as possible to the center of the board while being more than 1 inch away from impassable terrain. The other 2 markers are placed with their centers on points on this line that are on either side of the central marker, as close to the center of the board as possible, but at least a third of a length of the long board edge and more than 1 inch away from impassable terrain. At the start of each of your player turns, each of your scoring units that is not carrying a marker may pick up a single marker whose center they are in the contact with. Remove the marker from the battlefield. This unit is now carrying that marker. Units carrying the marker with fewer than 3 full ranks cannot perform march moves. If a unit carrying a marker is destroyed or loses scoring, the opponent must immediately place the marker carried by this unit with the center on a point within 3 inches of it. Ignore the post-combat reform for those purposes. At the end of the game, the player with the most units carrying markers wins the secondary objective. King of the Hill. After spell selection, both players choose a terrain feature that isn't impassable terrain that is not fully inside their deployment zone, starting with the player who chose their deployment zone. A player captures their opponent's chosen terrain feature if any of the player's scoring units are inside the terrain feature at the end of the game. If a player captures their opponent's chosen terrain feature while not allowing their own to be captured, they win a secondary objective. Capture the flags. After spell selection, mark all scoring units on both players' army lists. If either player has fewer than 3 marked units, their opponent must mark enough units from this player's army list so that there be exactly 3 marked units. The player who has the lowest number of their marked units removed as casualties at the end of the game wins the secondary objective. Secure target. Immediately after determining deployment zones, both players place 1 marker on the battlefield, starting with the player who chose their deployment zone. Each player must place the marker with its center on a point that is more than 12 inches away from their deployment zone. and at least a third of the long board edge. At the end of the game, the player controlling the most markers wins the secondary objective. A marker is controlled by the player with the most scoring units within 6 inches of the center of the marker. If a unit is within 6 inches of the centers of both markers, it only counts as within 6 inches of the center of the marker which is the closest. Deployment phase has its own sequence. Firstly, you determine who deploys first. Take turns deploying units, declare intent to go first or second, deploy remaining units, deploy scouting units, move vanguard units, other rules and abilities, and roll for the first turn. If you are deploying scouting units, both players deploy their units to have been nominated to use their scout rules. When you are moving vanguarding units, both players move their units with vanguard ability, starting with the player who completed their normal deployment last. After that, you both roll a d6. A player who completed their normal deployment first adds the undeployed units number to their dice roll. If the player who completed their normal deployment first scores a higher result, they play first or second, whichever they previously declared. If the score is a tie, or the player who completed their normal deployment last scores a higher result, that player can now choose which player has the first turn.